Alright, in this video we're going to look at how we go about swapping RibTrim's UV target. Currently this one is hiding underneath there, and its RibTrim pattern, which is that 2D plane of polygons, which is sitting over here. If you watch the intro video, you know that I moved that pattern up here closer to the RibTrim geometry to ease editing. It can be anywhere, but for this demo I put it back over here just so we kind of are reminded how things are initially when you load the RibTrim assembly preset. And again, just as a reminder, this is our UV target mesh, which has been moved over here so it corresponds with the geometry we want to trim. But again, initially when it was set up, if we just reset its transform, it was over here. This is the center of the Modo universe here, and I had just transformed it up there so it would be ready to trim. So to swap in either a new UV target or a new pattern, we need to go to the RibTrim's Mesh Ops. And here's RibTrim right here inside the RibTrim Alpha folder. And there are all of the Mesh Ops. And I've color-coded them here. You know, there's really not much you'll ever need to be doing in here, but to kind of help with it, I've color-coded them. Green are things that you might need or want to manipulate within the actual mesh op list. Red things are things you should never touch. Orange things are things that are kind of more advanced, and there are things within them that you might edit. And gray things, these dark gray things, are all things that are controlled by this little UI and its associated popover form. Whoops, associated popover form. And therefore, editing here within the mesh ops won't have any effect because they're all controlled via these other methods. All right, so anyway, the ones we're interested in right now are the target and the pattern. So way down here at the bottom, which is where mesh ops start, there's a merge mesh, and that's where our pattern is added. So that's really sort of the start of the whole process of building this array of blocks. All comes from this pattern. And we just have a simple grid there now. And you see up here in the item list, I've opened up two of the subfolders inside the RibTrim folder. One is the UV targets folder, and the other is the patterns folder. And that's where we have some other sample patterns. So, and I've given them a name with pattern in it to make them easy to recognize when we go to swap them. And to swap them, we use the little swap button here. And we go to existing, and we see our other patterns in here. So I'm just going to select this one, double click, and now you see we have a different pattern. Now, of course, this didn't change because this is simply a mesh. This is like a reference. That's what merge mesh is about. So what we did was we switched from that mesh, which I'm going to hide now, to this mesh. And it gives us that slightly more irregular pattern. In a very similar fashion, we can change the UV target mesh. So that's it sitting there, that sort of hemispherical thing that we distorted to fit on the ellipsoid in the original intro video. But again, it's just a mesh. I mean, I can hide it, show it. And there are a couple other targets here. And we'll look at using this cylinder instead of that hemisphere. So I'll make it visible here again. It doesn't have to be visible, just help us see what's going on. Go back to the RibTrim assembly itself, and we see this item, RibTrim UV transform. And if we open that up, we see target and UV target hemisphere, which is the mesh that we were using, that we are using, and we're going to swap that out. And while we still have the same swap button here, that we can use to switch to another mesh. A couple other things we should look at first. If we look at that mesh op, UV transform, you see that it specifies the target mesh as well as the target UV map. And with most meshes, as you know in Modo, usually quite often there's only the texture UV map. But for this hemisphere, I actually created a couple of UV maps. One is more conformal, and one is just a straightforward kind of planar projection onto that hemisphere. And the conformal one is the one that's being used at the moment. So when you switch to a different target mesh, you'll also need to go in here and make sure that you have the desired UV map. All right, so we're going to go ahead and swap and start using this cylinder instead. So I just hit that button, and I see, let's see, UV target cylinder. Double click on that, and you'll notice it's not wrapping around the cylinder, and that's just what we were talking about. That's because the target map has not been specified. So texture is our target UV map in this case, and there we go. We're now wrapping around the cylinder. So I will follow this up with another video that will get into more detail about manipulating the pattern and its relationship to the UV coordinates of the UV target mesh. Lots of interesting options there, and we'll see you there. Thanks.